The words hit me like a physical blow across the face. I was sitting at my parents' dining room table in their suburban Ohio home, the same table where I had eaten countless Sunday dinners, homework sessions, and holiday meals. The familiar smell of my mother's pot roast filled the air, and the evening light streamed through the windows, just like it had when I was a kid. But everything changed in that moment, when my mother looked me straight in the eyes and said those devastating words that would alter our family forever. I had just shared the news about my promotion to regional sales manager at the tech company, where I had been working for the past 5 years. Instead of celebration, I got a cold reality check that shattered every assumption I had about my place in this family. The shock of that dinner conversation lingered for days. I kept replaying my mother Linda's words in my mind, trying to understand how I had become such an afterthought in my own family. My father Robert had simply nodded when she made that declaration, adding that I should be more selfless like my sister Jessica. The favoritism had always been there, subtle but persistent, but hearing it stated so bluntly was like having a wound exposed to harsh light. I decided to take action by investigating our family's financial arrangements. For the past 3 years, I had been contributing $500 monthly to what my parents called the Family Emergency Fund. It was supposed to be a safety net for unexpected medical expenses, home repairs, or genuine crises. I trusted that my contributions were being saved responsibly for true emergencies. What I discovered made my blood run cold. I drove to the bank on Wednesday afternoon during my lunch break and requested a detailed statement for the joint account. The teller, Mrs. Henderson, had known our family for years and printed out the records without question. As I sat in my car outside the bank scanning through 12 months of transactions, the truth became crystal clear. Over the past year, $15,000 had been withdrawn in regular monthly installments of $1,250. The memo line on each withdrawal read simply, "Educational expenses." My parents had been systematically draining the emergency fund to pay for my nephew Tommy and niece Emma's private school tuition at Riverside Academy, the prestigious institution that cost nearly $15,000 per year per child. Not a single dollar had gone toward actual emergencies. Instead, my hard-earned money had been redirected to ensure that Jessica's children could attend the most expensive school in the county, while she and her husband Marcus maintained their comfortable lifestyle. The betrayal cut deep because I had been making sacrifices to contribute that money-eating lunch at my desk, instead of going out with colleagues driving my old Honda Civic, instead of upgrading to something newer. I drove straight to my parents' house that evening. My father was in his recliner watching the news while my mother prepared dinner in the kitchen. The normalcy of the scene made the confrontation even more surreal. "We need to discuss the family emergency fund," I said, placing the bank statements on the coffee table in front of my father. His face went pale as he looked at the papers. "Andy, we can explain this." "Explain what?" "How you used my contributions to pay for private school without telling me how you violated the trust of an emergency fund for non-emergency expenses." My mother emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Jessica needed help with the children's education. You don't have kids, so you don't understand how expensive good schools are." "That's not the point, Mom. We agreed this money was for emergencies. Medical bills, home repairs, genuine crises. Not private school tuition for kids whose parents can afford their own mortgage and car payments." "Jessica and Marcus are building their future," my father said defensively. "Marcus just started his dental practice. They needed support during the transition period. Then they should have asked me directly instead of having you steal from our emergency fund. And you should have told me before making unilateral decisions about money I contributed." The argument escalated for nearly an hour. My parents kept defending their actions, claiming that family meant helping each other without keeping score. They insisted that I was being selfish and materialistic, that Jessica's needs were more pressing than my financial boundaries. Finally, I made my decision. I'm removing my name from all joint accounts effective immediately. I'll no longer contribute to any shared family funds, and I'm establishing my own emergency savings at a different bank." "You can't be serious," my mother said, her voice rising. "You're going to abandon your family over money." "No, I'm protecting myself from being taken advantage of. There's a difference." The next morning, I opened new accounts at First National Bank across town. I transferred my remaining balance from the joint account and closed all shared credit cards where I was listed as an authorized user. The process was surprisingly straightforward, but emotionally exhausting. Jessica called me that afternoon, her voice shaking with anger. "Mom told me what you did. How could you abandon the family like this? Those kids depend on our support." "Those kids depend on their parents' support," I replied calmly. "I was never consulted about using emergency funds for private school tuition. If you needed help, you should have asked me directly." "We shouldn't have to beg you for help. Family means supporting each other automatically. Family also means honesty and respect. Using my money without permission isn't support, it's theft." She hung up on me, but I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had established clear boundaries and taken control of my financial future. The guilt was overwhelming at times, especially when I thought about Tommy and Emma, but I knew that enabling this pattern would only make things worse in the long run. My parents called several times over the following weeks, alternating between anger and attempts at emotional manipulation. They couldn't understand why their compliant, predictable son was suddenly standing up for himself. But I had learned an important lesson about the difference between being generous and being exploited. 2 months after establishing my financial independence, I met Sarah at a networking event hosted by my company. She was presenting her architectural firm's portfolio to potential corporate clients, and her presentation on sustainable building design was captivating. Sarah had graduated from Cornell with dual degrees in architecture and environmental science, and she had built her practice around creating energy-efficient commercial buildings. We started dating, casually meeting for coffee and attending local events around Columbus. Sarah was refreshingly direct about her ambitions and goals. She had no interest in playing games or pretending to be someone she wasn't. Her firm was designing a new municipal building that would serve as a model for green construction throughout the state. After 6 weeks of dating, I decided to introduce Sarah to my family. Despite our recent conflicts, I hoped that meeting someone important to me might help repair some of the damage from our financial disagreements. I was optimistic that they would appreciate Sarah's intelligence and accomplishments. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late October. Sarah arrived wearing a professional but elegant dress, carrying a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of flowers for my mother. She had researched my family beforehand, asking thoughtful questions about my parents' interests and hobbies. The trouble started before we even sat down for the meal. My mother immediately began interrogating Sarah about her career plans, but not in a supportive way. "So, Sarah, you run your own business. That must be very demanding. When do you plan to settle down and start a family?" Sarah handled the question gracefully. "I'm passionate about my work, and I've worked hard to establish my practice. I believe it's possible to have both a successful career and a family when the time is right." "Well, Jessica has always prioritized family," my mother continued. "She understands that children need their mother's full attention, especially during their formative years." My father jumped into the conversation with even less subtlety. "You're what, 32? The biological clock doesn't wait for career aspirations. Jessica had Tommy when she was 26 and Emma 2 years later. Smart planning." I could see Sarah's jaw tighten slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I think every woman should make the choices that work best for her situation. There's no single right path for everyone." Jessica, who had arrived with Marcus and the kids for the family dinner, decided to escalate the tension. It's easy to say that when you're prioritizing yourself over family responsibilities. Some of us understand that sacrifice is part of being a woman. "I don't see building a successful business as selfish," Sarah replied politely. I'm contributing to my community by creating jobs and designing buildings that will benefit future generations. That's nice in theory. Jessica continued, but children need stability and presence. Career women who think they're too good for traditional family roles often regret those choices later. The atmosphere grew increasingly uncomfortable as my family continued their passive-aggressive assault on Sarah's life choices. They peppered her with questions about her biological timeline, her willingness to relocate for a husband's career, and her views on child-rearing. Every answer was met with subtle criticism or unfavorable comparisons to Jessica's domestic choices. During dessert, my mother made her most pointed comment. Andy needs a partner who understands family loyalty, someone who won't pull him away from his responsibilities to the people who raised him. Sarah maintained her dignity throughout the evening, but I could see the impact of their hostility. After dinner, she helped clear the table and thanked my parents for their hospitality, but her usual warmth had been replaced by polite distance. On the drive back to her apartment, Sarah was quiet for several miles before finally speaking. Andy, I've never experienced anything like that. I've met skeptical families before, but that felt like a coordinated attack on everything I've worked for. I'm so sorry, I said, feeling embarrassed and angry. They had no right to treat you that way. It wasn't just rude, it was calculated. They wanted me to know that I don't fit their expectations for your life partner. The question is, do you agree with them? Absolutely not. I admire everything you've accomplished. I'm proud to be with someone who has built something meaningful with her own talents and determination. Sarah nodded, but I could tell the damage was done. The evening had revealed how my family would treat anyone who didn't conform to their narrow expectations for my life. They had essentially declared war on any relationship that might threaten their ability to maintain control over my choices. Over the following weeks, I made a conscious decision to keep my relationship with Sarah separate from my family. I stopped sharing details about our dates or future plans with my parents. When they asked about Sarah, I gave brief, non-committal responses that didn't invite further discussion. This separation was difficult because I had always shared important aspects of my life with my family, despite our recent conflicts. But I realized that they would sabotage any relationship that represented independence or different values from their own. Sarah was too important to me to subject her to their ongoing hostility and manipulation. My parents noticed the change immediately. They began asking pointed questions about why I wasn't bringing Sarah around anymore, whether we were still together, and if I was hiding something from them. Their curiosity was framed as concern, but I recognized it as a desire to maintain surveillance over my personal life. The experience taught me that their controlling behavior extended far beyond financial matters. They wanted to dictate not just how I spent my money, but whom I loved, what choices I made, and how I structured my adult life. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. 3 months after the disastrous dinner with Sarah, I was in the middle of an important client presentation when my phone buzzed with an emergency call. I had silenced the ringer, but the repeated vibrations made me check the caller ID. It was my Aunt Patricia, and she never called unless something serious had happened. I excused myself from the conference room and answered the call in the hallway. Patricia's voice was shaking as she delivered the news that my father had suffered a heart attack at his office and was being rushed to Columbus General Hospital. The ambulance was already en route, and the family was gathering in the emergency waiting room. I immediately canceled my presentation, briefed my colleague James about the client needs, and raced to the hospital. During the 20-minute drive, my mind was flooded with memories of my father teaching me to ride a bike, helping with homework, and attending my high school baseball games. Despite our recent conflicts, he was still my dad, and the thought of losing him was terrifying. When I arrived at the hospital, I was shocked by the reception I received from my extended family. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Dennis, and several cousins were clustered around my mother and Jessica in the waiting area. But when I approached the group, the conversation stopped abruptly. The warmth and concern I expected was replaced by cold, distant politeness. "Andy, you made it," Aunt Patricia said, with a tone that suggested surprise rather than relief. "Of course I made it. How is Dad? What are the doctors saying?" My mother looked up from her chair with red-rimmed eyes. "They're running tests to determine the extent of the damage. We won't know more until after the cardiac catheterization." I sat down next to my mother, but Uncle Dennis immediately stood up and moved to a different section of the waiting room. Cousin Jennifer, whom I had always been close to, avoided making eye contact. The atmosphere was strange and uncomfortable, as if I was an unwelcome intruder rather than a concerned son. After an hour of awkward silence and whispered conversations that stopped when I came near, I excused myself to get coffee from the hospital cafeteria. As I walked down the corridor, I heard Aunt Patricia's voice carrying from the waiting room. "I still can't believe how selfish he's become. Poor Linda has been dealing with this stress while Andy completely abandoned the family." I stopped walking and moved closer to the doorway, staying out of sight, but within hearing range. "Jessica told us everything," Uncle Dennis was saying. "He refused to help with the kids' education and cut off all financial support, right when they needed it most. What kind of son does that to his own family?" "Money changed him," Cousin Jennifer added. "He got that promotion and decided he was too good for family responsibilities. Jessica said he won't even help with basic expenses anymore." My stomach dropped as I realized the scope of Jessica's manipulation. She had spent months systematically poisoning my extended family against me, creating a narrative where I was the selfish villain who had abandoned his struggling family. Every cousin, aunt, and uncle had been fed a carefully crafted story that painted me as greedy and heartless. I returned to the waiting room with my coffee, but now I understood why everyone was treating me like a pariah. In their minds, I was the ungrateful son who had turned his back on his family during difficult times. Jessica had successfully rewritten history, erasing the context of financial manipulation and boundary violations that had led to my decisions. When the cardiac surgeon finally emerged to update us on my father's condition, the news was cautiously optimistic. The heart attack had been significant, but not massive, and the catheterization had revealed 2 blocked arteries that could be treated with stents. The procedure would happen immediately, and my father had a good chance of full recovery with proper follow-up care. As we waited during the 3-hour procedure, I found myself sitting alone while my extended family gathered around my mother and Jessica, offering comfort and support. The isolation was painful, but also illuminating. I could see how effectively Jessica had manipulated the family narrative to position herself as the devoted daughter while casting me as the absent, selfish son. When my father emerged from surgery groggy but stable, I was allowed a brief visit. He squeezed my hand and thanked me for being there, unaware of the family dynamics swirling around his hospital bed. His gratitude was genuine, which made the extended family's coldness even more painful. Over the following days, as my father recovered in the cardiac care unit, my mother began making requests for financial assistance with medical expenses. The hospital bills would be substantial even with insurance coverage, and she assumed I would step up to help with costs. "We'll need to discuss how to handle the co-payments and rehabilitation expenses," she said during one of my visits. "This family crisis requires everyone to contribute." I agreed to help with legitimate medical expenses, but I insisted on seeing bills and making payments directly to providers rather than contributing to another family fund. My mother was offended by what she saw as distrust, but I had learned the importance of maintaining financial transparency. The experience taught me that Jessica's manipulation had been far more extensive and damaging than I had realized. She had spent months crafting a narrative that isolated me from extended family support, ensuring that any future conflicts would be viewed through the lens of my supposed selfishness and abandonment. But despite the painful isolation, I knew I had made the right choices about establishing boundaries and protecting my financial independence. 2 weeks after my father's successful recovery and discharge from the hospital, I was settling into my evening routine when I heard a soft knock at my apartment door. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and I wasn't expecting any visitors. When I looked through the peephole, I was surprised to see Marcus standing in the hallway looking nervous and disheveled. I opened the door to find my brother-in-law fidgeting with his car keys, his usually confident demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Marcus was typically well-groomed and composed, but tonight his shirt was wrinkled, his hair was messy, and he had dark circles under his eyes. "Marcus, is everything okay, is it, Dad?" No, your father is fine. Andy, I really need to talk to you. Can I come in? It's important." I invited him into my living room offering coffee or water, but he declined both. Marcus sat on the edge of my couch, leaning forward with his hands clasped tightly together. The silence stretched for several moments before he finally began speaking. "Andy, I'm going to be completely honest with you about something, and I need you to promise that this conversation stays between us. Jessica can't know we talked." This opening immediately put me on alert. Any conversation that required secrecy from his wife was likely to be problematic. "I'm listening, but I can't promise anything until I know what we're discussing." Marcus took a deep breath and looked directly at me. "The dental practice is failing. We're facing bankruptcy within the next 3 months if I can't secure additional financing." The confession hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Marcus had spent the past 2 years bragging about his growing patient base, new equipment purchases, and expansion plans. The idea that the practice was actually failing was completely contrary to everything the family had been told. "I don't understand. Jessica said you were booked solid and considering hiring an associate dentist." "That's what I told her, but it's not true. I've been losing money for the past 8 months. My overhead costs are too high. I overextended on equipment loans and I'm not generating enough revenue to cover expenses." Marcus went on to explain the full scope of the financial disaster. He had purchased expensive digital imaging equipment and a state-of-the-art dental chair system financing nearly $200,000 in upgrades that he couldn't afford. His patient base was smaller than projected, and insurance reimbursements were lower than expected. The combination had created a cash flow crisis that was spiraling out of control. "How have you been paying your personal expenses?" I asked. "Credit cards. I've been using cash advances to cover the mortgage, car payments, and household expenses. Jessica thinks the practice income is covering everything, but I've actually been borrowing money to maintain our lifestyle." The picture became clearer as Marcus continued. He had been living a complete financial lie for months, using credit to maintain the appearance of success, while his business collapsed around him. Jessica had no idea that their comfortable lifestyle was built on borrowed money and false projections. "The credit cards are maxed out now," Marcus continued. "I owe about $50,000 across 6 different cards, plus the equipment loans and practice overhead. I need $75,000 to consolidate the debt and keep the practice operating while I rebuild the patient base." "And you want me to co-sign a loan for that amount?" "Yes. My credit is ruined from missing payments and high utilization. The bank won't approve a business loan without a qualified co-signer. You have excellent credit and stable income. It would be a huge help to the family." I studied Marcus's face as he made his request. The desperation was genuine, but so was the manipulation. He was asking me to risk my financial security to cover his poor business decisions, all while keeping Jessica in the dark about their true situation. Marcus co-signing a loan means I'm legally responsible if you can't make payments. Given that your practice is already failing, what guarantee do I have that you'll be able to repay $75,000? "I have a business plan for rebuilding the patient base. I've identified the problems and I know how to fix them. Within 2 years, the practice will be profitable again, and I'll pay you back everything." "But you just told me you've been lying to Jessica about your financial situation for months. You've been using credit cards to maintain a lifestyle you can't afford. Why should I trust your business projections when your judgment has been so poor up to this point?" Marcus's composure began to crack as I challenged his request. "Look, I made some mistakes, but I can turn this around. Jessica and the kids are depending on this. Do you want to see your nephew and niece lose their home because their father made some bad business decisions? The emotional manipulation was obvious but also effective. Tommy and Emma were innocent victims of their father's poor choices, and the thought of them suffering was genuinely distressing. But I also knew that co-signing a loan for someone with Marcus's track record would be financially suicidal. I'm willing to help, but not by co-signing a bank loan. I could provide a direct loan with formal documentation collateral and a realistic repayment schedule based on your actual practice income. Andy, this is family. I don't want a business transaction with contracts and collateral requirements. I need family support, not a commercial relationship. Family support means making responsible decisions that protect everyone involved. I'm not going to risk my financial security on a handshake agreement with someone who's been lying about his business performance. Marcus stood up abruptly, his frustration obvious. I should have known you'd turn this into some kind of business negotiation. Jessica was right about how you've changed. What does Jessica know about any of this? Nothing specific, but she knows you've been selfish and unsupportive lately. If you refuse to help save your family's future, she'll understand exactly what kind of person you've become. The threat was clear. If I didn't agree to co-sign the loan on Marcus's terms, he would tell Jessica that I had refused to help during their financial crisis. He would frame my responsible approach as selfishness and abandonment, adding more fuel to the narrative that I was an uncaring brother. Marcus, I'm not going to be manipulated into making a poor financial decision. If you want my help, it will be on terms that protect both of us. If you prefer to handle this differently, that's your choice. He left my apartment angry and frustrated, but I felt confident in my decision. As soon as he was gone, I sent him a text message summarizing our conversation and reiterating my offer to provide a direct loan with proper documentation. I wanted written evidence of our discussion in case he tried to misrepresent what had transpired. The experience confirmed my growing realization that my family viewed me primarily as a financial resource, rather than a person with legitimate interests and boundaries. Marcus's request had been framed as family loyalty, but it was actually a request for me to subsidize his poor business decisions while accepting all the financial risk. 6 weeks after Marcus's late-night visit to my apartment, my father was healthy enough for the family to organize a recovery celebration dinner. The gathering was planned for the first Saturday in December at my parents' house, with extended family invited to mark Dad's successful return to normal activities after his heart attack. I arrived at the house to find the living room filled with aunts, uncles, and cousins who had traveled from around Ohio to participate in the celebration. The atmosphere was warm and festive, with my mother's famous lasagna filling the house with delicious aromas, and my father looking healthier than he had in months. However, I quickly noticed that the cold treatment from my extended family had not improved since the hospital incident. Conversation stopped when I entered rooms, and relatives who had once been friendly now offered only polite acknowledgments of my presence. Jessica had clearly continued her campaign to isolate me from family support. During dinner, Jessica stood up to make a toast honoring our father's recovery. Her speech started appropriately expressing gratitude for his health and acknowledging the medical team's excellent care. But then she shifted direction in a way that caught me completely off guard. This health crisis reminded us all about the importance of family loyalty and supporting each other during difficult times. Jessica said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Some family members stepped up during Dad's emergency, while others remained focused on their own priorities. The room fell silent as everyone realized that Jessica was moving beyond a simple toast into something more confrontational. She looked directly at me as she continued. Andy, you've been blessed with financial success and career advancement, but with those blessings come family responsibilities. While you've been focused on protecting your own interests, the rest of us have been dealing with real challenges and struggles. I could feel the attention of 20 family members focusing on me as Jessica continued her coordinated attack. This was not a spontaneous outburst, It was a carefully planned public confrontation designed to pressure me into compliance. Tommy and Emma are approaching college age, and as their uncle with no children of your own to worry about, you have an obligation to contribute to their education funds. Family means making sacrifices for the next generation, not hoarding wealth, while your nephew and niece face uncertain futures. My mother immediately voiced her support for Jessica's position. Andy has been resistant to family responsibilities lately. We've tried to help him understand that his success creates obligations to help relatives who are struggling. Uncle Dennis chimed in from across the room. When I was Andy's age, family came first. We didn't question helping with education expenses or medical bills. That's what family means. Aunt Patricia nodded emphatically. Jessica has always put family first, even when it meant sacrificing her own ambitions. Andy needs to learn that same lesson. The coordinated nature of the attack was obvious. Jessica had prepared talking points in listed allies and chosen the public setting to maximize pressure and embarrassment. She was counting on my desire to avoid a family scene to force my compliance with her demands. But I had prepared for this moment. Over the past months, I had carefully documented every conversation, recorded several phone calls where legally permitted, and saved text messages that revealed the manipulation tactics being used against me. I had evidence of Marcus's failed business and loan request, Jessica's lies to extended family, and my parents' misuse of the emergency fund. I stood up calmly and walked to my car to retrieve a folder from my briefcase. When I returned to the dining room, the family was buzzing with conversation about what I might be planning. Jessica looked confident that she had successfully cornered me into submission. Before we continue this conversation about family obligations, I said, opening the folder, I think everyone should understand the full context of our family's financial dynamics. I began by reading aloud the bank statements showing how my emergency fund contributions had been used for private school tuition without my knowledge or consent. The room grew quiet as relatives realized that Jessica's narrative about my selfishness was missing crucial details. Next, I played a brief recording of Marcus's loan request, where he admitted that his dental practice was failing, and he had been lying to Jessica about their finances for months. Several family members gasped when they heard him explain that he had been using credit cards to maintain their lifestyle while his business collapsed. Finally, I displayed text messages where Jessica had explicitly asked our cousins to pressure me about family obligations, while spreading false information about my willingness to help during genuine emergencies. Aunt Patricia, I said, looking directly at her, Jessica told you that I refused to help with Dad's medical expenses. Here are copies of the checks I wrote directly to the hospital and rehabilitation center. I paid over $4,000 in medical costs that insurance didn't cover. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically as family members realized they had been manipulated with false information. Jessica's face went white as her carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. Uncle Dennis, you said I was selfish and unsupportive, but Jessica never told you that I offered to help Marcus with a direct loan that included reasonable terms and documentation to protect both parties. She also didn't mention that my emergency fund contributions were being used without my consent for non-emergency expenses. Marcus, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke up. I asked Andy not to tell anyone about the loan discussion. And yet Jessica used my refusal to co-sign an undocumented loan as evidence that I don't care about family. I replied. She's been systematically misrepresenting my actions to turn all of you against me. Jessica finally found her voice, but her usual confidence was gone. Andy, you're taking everything out of context. We needed help, and you made it into a business transaction. I made it responsible. There's a difference. Marcus was asking me to risk $75,000 to cover business failures he had been hiding from you for months. A reasonable person would want documentation and collateral for that kind of loan. The room erupted in confused conversation as relatives tried to process the new information. Several family members approached me privately to apologize for their cold treatment admitting they had based their opinions on incomplete information from Jessica. My parents sat in stunned silence as they realized how extensively their daughter had been manipulating family relationships. My mother looked particularly shaken as she understood that her support for Jessica's demands had been based on lies and deliberate misrepresentations. "The truth is," I said, addressing the entire room, "I'm willing to maintain relationships with all of you, but I won't continue to be manipulated, lied about, or treated as a family ATM. I've established reasonable boundaries about how I'm willing to help, and those boundaries will remain in place." Jessica left the dinner early with Marcus and the children, but not before several family members confronted her about the false information she had been spreading. The celebration continued, but with a very different tone, as relatives began to understand the real dynamics that had been creating family tension. As I drove home that evening, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth was finally exposed, but the process had damaged relationships that might never fully recover. However, I knew that continuing to enable Jessica's manipulation would have been even more destructive in the long run. The 3 months following the family dinner confrontation brought dramatic changes to our family dynamics. Marcus's dental practice officially closed in February after he was unable to secure refinancing or find a buyer for his patient base. The failure was swift and complete, leaving him with enormous debt and no viable way to maintain their previous lifestyle. Jessica and Marcus were forced to sell their house in the upscale Riverside subdivision, where they had lived for 5 years. Even after paying off the mortgage and settling some of Marcus's business debts, they had insufficient funds for a down payment on another home. The rental market in their preferred neighborhoods was beyond their reduced budget, leaving them with limited options. My parents reluctantly agreed to let Jessica's family move into the family home temporarily while they searched for affordable housing. The arrangement was presented as a short-term solution, perhaps a few months, until Marcus could find steady employment and rebuild their financial foundation. From my perspective as an outside observer, the living situation deteriorated rapidly. My parents' comfortable 3-bedroom ranch house was suddenly home to 6 people spanning 3 generations. The main floor had to accommodate 2 adults and 2 children who were accustomed to having their own space and privacy. My father's recovery routine was disrupted by constant noise and activity. Jessica's expectations for her parents' support extended far beyond simple housing. She assumed that her mother would provide free childcare for Tommy and Emma during school breaks and summer vacation. She expected home-cooked meals to be prepared according to her children's preferences and dietary restrictions. She made requests for my parents to handle laundry, house cleaning, and transportation duties, as if they were hired staff, rather than grandparents providing emergency assistance. Marcus's job search was half-hearted at best. He spent most days playing video games in the basement or watching sports programming while claiming to be networking and exploring opportunities. His dental license remained valid, but he showed little initiative in finding employment with an established practice or exploring alternative career paths that might utilize his skills. The children's behavior created additional stress in the household. Tommy, now 11 years old, had difficulty adjusting to the loss of his bedroom and privacy. He became moody and defiant, arguing with his grandparents about household rules and expectations. Emma, at 9, was confused and upset about the dramatic changes in her living situation, often crying at bedtime and asking when they would move back to their real house. My father's health became a serious concern as the stress of the overcrowded household began taking its toll. His cardiologist noted elevated blood pressure during a routine follow-up appointment and recommended reducing environmental stressors that might impact his recovery. The constant noise, disrupted routines, and family conflicts were exactly the kind of pressures he needed to avoid. During this period, I maintained minimal contact with my parents and sister while focusing on my own life and relationship with Sarah. Her architectural firm had secured the municipal building contract, and the project was generating significant positive publicity for her business. Our relationship had deepened considerably, and we were discussing long-term plans, including the possibility of moving in together. In late March, my mother called me for the first time since the family dinner confrontation. Her voice was strained and exhausted as she explained the deteriorating situation at home. "Andy, I need to be honest with you about something. Maybe we didn't realize how much pressure we had been putting on you over the years. Seeing how Jessica expects us to handle everything while Marcus does nothing is opening my eyes to some uncomfortable truths." The admission was significant because my mother rarely acknowledged mistakes or questioned her support for Jessica's decisions. She went on to explain that Jessica had been making increasing demands for financial support, expecting my parents to pay for groceries, utilities, and incidental expenses, while contributing nothing to household maintenance or expenses. "Your father had another episode of chest pain yesterday. The doctor says it's stress-related, not cardiac, but he needs a calmer environment to maintain his recovery." I listened carefully as my mother described the family dynamics that were creating impossible pressures on my father's health. Jessica's entitlement had not diminished despite their financial crisis, and Marcus's passivity was enabling increasingly unrealistic expectations for support. "I've been thinking about your suggestion for family therapy," she continued. "Would you be willing to help arrange counseling sessions if Jessica refuses to participate?" This conversation represented a significant shift in my mother's perspective. For the first time, she was acknowledging that Jessica's behavior patterns were problematic, and that enabling those patterns was not helping anyone involved. She was also recognizing that my boundary setting had been protective rather than selfish. I agreed to research family therapists and offered to pay for sessions, but I insisted that any therapy would need to address the underlying patterns of manipulation and entitlement that had created the current crisis. I also made it clear that I would not provide direct financial assistance to Jessica and Marcus, regardless of therapy outcomes. Over the following weeks, my parents began implementing changes in their household that reflected their growing understanding of healthy boundaries. They established expectations for Jessica and Marcus to contribute to household expenses and maintenance. They set limits on childcare responsibilities and required advance notice for babysitting requests. Jessica's reaction to these new boundaries was predictably negative. She accused her parents of being unsupportive during her family's time of crisis and complained that they were treating her like a tenant rather than a daughter. She refused to participate in family therapy, claiming that everyone else was the problem and that she was the victim of circumstances beyond her control. Marcus finally secured employment as a dental hygienist with a group practice across town. The position paid significantly less than his previous income as a practice owner, but it provided steady wages and health insurance benefits. The job required him to acknowledge that his business ownership aspirations had been premature and that he needed to rebuild his career more gradually. As summer approached, my parents made the difficult decision to sell their family home and downsize to a smaller house that would not accommodate Jessica's family. The decision was partly financial, as the ongoing household expenses were straining their retirement budget, but it was also motivated by their recognition that the current arrangement was unsustainable for everyone involved. The process of forcing Jessica and Marcus to find independent housing was emotionally challenging for my parents, but it proved to be a crucial step toward re-establishing healthy family relationships. For the first time in years, Jessica was required to live within her means rather than relying on family subsidies to maintain an unrealistic lifestyle. My own relationship with my parents began to improve as they developed a better understanding of boundary setting and personal responsibility. They started to appreciate that my earlier refusal to enable problematic behavior had actually been protective of long-term family health rather than selfish abandonment. 1 year after the explosive family dinner confrontation, my life had transformed in ways I could never have anticipated. The promotion to vice president of sales had come through in March, bringing my annual salary to 6 figures for the first time in my career. The position involved managing regional operations across 3 states and required travel, but it also provided the financial security and professional recognition I had worked toward for years. Sarah's architectural firm had become one of the most respected sustainable design companies in Ohio after the successful completion of the municipal building project. The structure had received state recognition for environmental innovation and had generated several additional contracts for her business. Our relationship had evolved into a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared ambitions. The family therapy sessions that my parents had finally embraced proved to be transformational, even though Jessica never participated. Working with Dr. Martinez, a licensed family therapist, my parents began to understand how their enabling patterns had created unhealthy dependency rather than genuine family support. They learned to distinguish between helping family members overcome temporary challenges and subsidizing poor life choices that prevented personal growth. Marcus had surprised everyone by embracing his role as a dental hygienist and showing genuine commitment to rebuilding his career. The humbling experience of business failure had forced him to confront his unrealistic expectations and poor financial planning. He was taking evening business courses at the community college, hoping to eventually become a practice manager, rather than jumping back into practice ownership. Jessica's transformation was slower and more reluctant, but eventually significant. The reality of supporting her family on Marcus's reduced income had forced her to abandon many of the entitled behaviors that had characterized her approach to family relationships. She found part-time work as a substitute teacher, contributing income while maintaining flexibility for childcare responsibilities. Tommy and Emma adjusted well to their family's more modest lifestyle. The transition to public school had been challenging initially, but both children developed stronger character and resilience as they learned to appreciate opportunities rather than expecting luxury. Tommy discovered a talent for soccer and made friends with teammates from diverse economic backgrounds. Emma joined the school choir and flourished in the more inclusive environment. My parents completed their downsizing to a comfortable 2-bedroom house in a senior-friendly neighborhood. The smaller space eliminated the possibility of extended family members moving in during financial crises, which helped maintain healthier boundaries around independence and responsibility. They seemed happier and less stressed without the constant pressure of managing other people's problems. The extended family relationships that had been damaged by Jessica's manipulation campaigns gradually healed as relatives understood the true dynamics that had created conflict. Aunt Patricia apologized for her harsh judgment and invited Sarah and me to her daughter's wedding, treating us with genuine warmth. Uncle Dennis acknowledged that he had been unfairly influenced by incomplete information and made efforts to rebuild our relationship. In September, I proposed to Sarah during a weekend trip to Hocking Hills State Park. The proposal was private and intimate, reflecting the authentic relationship we had built away from family pressures and expectations. She accepted enthusiastically, and we began planning a wedding that would celebrate our partnership rather than conforming to anyone else's vision of what our marriage should look like. The announcement of our engagement was met with genuine excitement from my family, a dramatic change from their earlier hostility toward Sarah's career ambitions and independent nature. My parents had learned to appreciate her accomplishments and strength, rather than viewing them as threats to family control. Jessica offered congratulations that seemed sincere, recognizing that her previous antagonism had been motivated by envy rather than legitimate concern. During the engagement celebration dinner at our new family tradition of meeting at neutral restaurants rather than someone's home, my mother made a heartfelt speech that acknowledged years of misguided priorities and hurtful favoritism. Andy, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. For too many years, your father and I enabled behaviors that weren't healthy for anyone in this family. We confused enabling with love, and we asked you to subsidize choices that people needed to learn from independently. She continued with tears in her eyes. You showed real wisdom by establishing boundaries even when it was difficult and painful. You forced all of us to grow and take responsibility for our own lives. That took courage and strength that we didn't recognize at the time. My father added his own perspective on the transformation their family had experienced. Son, I realize now that real family support means helping each other become stronger and more capable, not preventing people from learning from their mistakes. You taught us that lesson by example. Jessica requested a private conversation with me after the dinner, and we walked outside to have an honest discussion about our relationship moving forward. Her demeanor was different from the defensive, entitled attitude that had characterized her behavior for years. Andy, I need to admit that I was wrong about a lot of things. I was jealous of your success and independence, and I tried to make you feel guilty for achieving things that I thought I deserved without earning them. She continued. I realize now that I had been manipulating family relationships to avoid taking responsibility for my own choices. Marcus and I made poor financial decisions, and instead of learning from those mistakes, I tried to make you pay for them. I appreciate you acknowledging that, I replied. I never wanted to hurt you or your children. I just needed to protect myself from being taken advantage of. I understand that now. Would you be willing to start over with our relationship? Not going back to the old patterns, but building something healthier based on honesty and respect. I agreed to work toward rebuilding our sibling relationship with clear boundaries and mutual respect. The conversation marked a turning point where Jessica finally took responsibility for her role in creating family conflicts and expressed genuine desire for positive change. The wedding planning process became an opportunity to implement healthy family dynamics rather than recreating old patterns of manipulation and control. Sarah and I made decisions based on our preferences and budget-accepting input from family members without feeling obligated to accommodate unrealistic expectations or demands. Tommy and Emma were excited to participate as ring bearer and flower girl roles that helped them feel included while allowing Sarah and me to maintain authority over our celebration. Jessica offered to help with planning tasks, but respected our choices when her suggestions were not adopted. The wedding ceremony in October was beautiful and meaningful, celebrating not just Sarah's and my commitment to each other, but also the healthier family relationships that had emerged from our difficult journey. My father officiated the ceremony after getting ordained online, a role that honored his recovery and our reconciliation. During my wedding toast, I reflected on the lessons that had been learned through our family's challenges and transformation. Real love means supporting each other's growth and independence, not trying to control each other's choices. Healthy families celebrate individual success rather than viewing it as a threat to group dynamics. The response from family and friends was overwhelmingly positive, with many guests commenting on the authenticity and joy that characterized our celebration. It was clear that the relationships built on honesty and respect were far stronger than those based on manipulation and enablement. As Sarah and I began our married life together, we maintained the boundary-setting practices that had been crucial to our individual and relationship success. We offered support to family members who were working toward positive goals, but we refused to enable destructive behaviors or subsidize poor choices. The most important lesson I learned through this entire experience was that real family support means empowering each other's growth and independence, rather than preventing natural consequences that promote learning and development. Setting boundaries was not selfish or abandonment. It was the foundation for healthier relationships built on mutual respect rather than manipulation and dependency. My parents, Jessica, Marcus, and even Tommy and Emma, all benefited from learning to take responsibility for their own choices and outcomes. The family became stronger and more resilient because each member developed personal accountability and self-reliance. 6 months after our wedding, Jessica called to share news that she had been accepted into a master's degree program in education administration. She was planning to advance her career while maintaining her family responsibilities, inspired by Sarah's example of balancing professional ambitions with personal commitments. Marcus had been promoted to senior hygienist and was being considered for a practice management position. His business failure had taught him valuable lessons about financial planning and realistic goal setting that made him a more responsible and effective employee. My parents were thriving in their retirement, traveling and pursuing hobbies that had been neglected during years of managing other people's crises. They had learned to offer emotional support and encouragement to their adult children, while maintaining healthy boundaries around financial and practical independence. The transformation of our family relationships proved that love and support are most effective when they promote growth and strength rather than dependency and manipulation. By setting boundaries and maintaining personal responsibility, each family member became capable of contributing positively to relationships rather than draining resources and energy from others. Looking back on that painful Sunday dinner when my mother declared that I would always be second priority, I realized that her statement inadvertently set me free to create a life based on my own values and choices. The journey was difficult and sometimes lonely, but it led to authentic relationships and genuine happiness that would not have been possible under the old patterns of manipulation and control. Today, as Sarah and I plan for our own children and continue building our careers, we are committed to raising a family that values independence, personal responsibility, and mutual respect. We will support our children's dreams and ambitions while teaching them that real strength comes from overcoming challenges rather than avoiding consequences. The experience taught me that putting yourself first doesn't mean being selfish or uncaring. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to enable their destructive behaviors and force them to develop their own strength and capabilities. True family loyalty means helping each other become the best versions of ourselves, not preventing the growth that comes from facing life's challenges with courage and determination. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who were taking advantage of your generosity? How did you handle the guilt and pressure when relatives accused you of being selfish for protecting your own interests? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it resonated with your own family challenges. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming family manipulation and building healthier relationships. And please share this story with friends or family members who might benefit from learning about the importance of boundaries and personal responsibility. Your support helps us continue sharing these important life lessons that can transform families and relationships for the better. Thank you for listening, and remember that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is refuse to enable the very people you love most.